Hello, and welcome to San Francisco Opera Guild's third virtual opera preview of the 2024-25 season. My name is Jennifer Bienemay, and I'm a member of San Francisco Opera Guild's Board of Directors. Today, we will be learning about Richard Wagner's Tristan und Isolde from Professor Derek Katz of UC Santa Barbara. Before we jump in, I'd like to share a little information about San Francisco Opera Guild and our mission. San Francisco Opera Guild was established in 1939, and while we are technically a separate nonprofit organization from San Francisco Opera, many of our programs support the opera's work and help bring opera education to the community. Today's presentation is part of the Opera Previews program, a free lecture series featuring distinguished professors and dramaturgs that help enrich the audience's experience of main stage productions at San Francisco Opera. However, our primary commitment is to bring quality education and arts engagement to schools around the San Francisco Bay Area. While you might be familiar with our in-school programs such as Opera Together and Sing a Story, we have an incredible range of offerings for students K through 12 that ignite a creative spark and grow curiosity in the arts. From the Opera Scouts to Voices for Social Justice, our teaching artists foster collaboration, self-esteem, and critical thinking skills in students with diverse backgrounds and life experiences. I encourage you to learn more about the Guild's work by visiting our website at sfoperaguild.com. If you have any questions about Derek's lecture, please drop them in the Q&A, and we'll do our best to address them. We will also be putting relevant links in the chat and engaging with your questions throughout the program. Now, on to the main event. We are pleased to welcome Professor Derek Katz as our guest speaker for tonight's preview. Derek is an associate professor of music history at the University of California, Santa Barbara, where he received his PhD. He also holds a degree from Harvard and has studied at the Free University of Berlin on a Fulbright fellowship. His book, Janacek Beyond the Borders, was published by the University of Rochester Press in 2009. In addition to a focus on Czech music, his more recent work deals with music and Mittelbau culture, émigré musicians, and institutional support for chamber music in the US in the mid-20th century. Derek also exclusively works in public musicology and audience enhancement. He has written for the New York Times, the San Francisco Opera, the Teatro Real Madrid, and the Bavarian State Opera. In addition to speaking appearances at the Lincoln Center and Carnegie Hall, he is also a frequent collaborator with San Francisco Opera Guild, the Ives Collective, and the Houseman Quartet. He is an enthusiastic amateur violist and chamber music player. Welcome, Derek.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. Thank you for the very kind introduction.
Thank you. I'm curious how many times you've seen Tristan und Isolde.
Well, I'm a little embarrassed to admit I've only seen it once. I went with my family when I was in high school to the Metropolitan Opera in New York. So I'm afraid I'm one of those annoying people that has opinions about different live radio performances from 1948, but hasn't seen it in the house that often. So I'm really looking forward to this production.
Oh, wonderful. Well, I'll be a first-timer. And for first-timers of this opera, can you offer a valuable insight related to the plot or the music to help us better understand this production?
Well, of course, I'll be going into those things in much greater depth in just a moment. But I think, and I hope I'm not just saying this because I'm an orchestral musician rather than a singer, but I think one of the great glories of this particular opera is the orchestral music that does so much to move us and to convince us of the importance of what's going on. So I think the big message of the talk to follow is going to be the events on stage are not so important, but the music is really deeply moving.
Oh, great, great. Well, thank you. I will let you take it from here.
Thank you very much. Okay, so thank you very much for coming to this talk. I wish that I could actually be in the same room with all of you and see your faces. It has been gently suggested to me that I am less engaging and entertaining than I usually am virtually. So I will try to bring a little bit of extra energy and compensate for that. So I'm very excited about Tristan and Isolde. I think any performance of Wagner's Tristan and Isolde is a special event. It's an opera that's unusual and cherishable in many ways, from its unusual length to the extraordinary demands on the singers and the title roles, which require voices of great power and endurance that are also capable of great beauty and subtlety. It's also a musical work with a distinctive harmonic language that has been incredibly influential and has been credited with breaking down the procedures that composers had been using for the previous 250 years and having a major role in ushering in 20th century modernism. I refer you to no less an authority than Giuseppe Verdi, who himself was not exactly a charter member of the Richard Wagner fan club, who said of Tristan, quote, he could never quite grasp that it had been created by a mere human being. So I'd like to start with a little bit about that plot. The story of Tristan and Isolde is from a very old legend that spread across Europe during the medieval era. Wagner's main source was a 13th century German poem by one Gottfried von Strasberg. There are a lot of differences between the retellings, but what they all have in common is a love triangle between the title characters, Tristan and Isolde, and King Mark. So there's a sense in which this story, like Pyramus and Thisbe or like Romeo and Juliet, is about doomed lovers from feuding factions. So we don't actually have that many characters to keep track of in the opera. So we, of course, have the title characters, Tristan, who is a Breton nobleman. So he's Celtic, he's from the north of France. And by voice type, he is not just a tenor, he is that very special kind of German tenor, the heroic tenor or Helden tenor that we get in the role of Tristan, the role of Siegfried, and a few other places in the German repertoire. Then, of course, we also have Isolde, who is the Princess of Ireland. She is a soprano. And Tristan is in the service of King Mark, who is from Cornwall. So you don't need to keep track of these places, but it is important that everyone is from someplace different, and there are these kind of political and social conflicts behind the personal relationships. So it's really only those three that you have to keep track of. But if you want to, sort of collect the whole set, each of the main characters comes with a sort of an accompanying figure who is in a supporting role who helps them in some way. So Isolde is attended by Brangena, her maid, also a soprano. Tristan is accompanied by his friend and servant or squire, Curvenal, a baritone. And King Mark apparently has a whole retinue of knights. The one who gets a small singing role is named Melot, who is also a tenor. And that's really it for named characters that you'll encounter in the opera. So as far as the action goes, which I will illustrate with a variety of pictures from different sources, in Act 1, we find ourselves on a ship. The ship is taking Tristan and Isolde from Ireland to Cornwall. Cornwall and Ireland have been feuding, and as part of a peace treaty, Tristan is bringing Isolde to marry King Mark in Cornwall. Isolde wishes to have no part of this and plans to both avenge herself on Tristan and kill herself by drinking a potion of death which has been brewed by her mother. Isolde's mother, the Queen of Ireland, is not just a queen, but a sorceress. In the event, Brangena substitutes a love potion for the death potion. Tristan and Isolde drink the love potion, fall deeply in love as the ship arrives in Cornwall. That brings us to the end of the first act. Act 2 is at night in Isolde's chamber. Isolde is waiting for Tristan to join her. King Mark and his men are off hunting. As soon as the sound of their hunting horns has faded into the distance, Brangena extinguishes a torch as a signal for Tristan that he can come and join Isolde, and they can enjoy a night of love. Despite Brangena's warnings, they are discovered by Mark and his men, And there's then a little conflict in which Melot wounds Tristan, end of Act 2. The third and final act is in Tristan's castle in Brittany. We're back to the north of France, where Tristan, thanks to the wounding by Melot, is on the point of death. And Courvenal there has summoned Isolde, who is going to arrive in a ship, and we hope that she will be able to heal Tristan. Isolde, in addition to her other magic powers, has healing powers. Isolde does arrive just in time for Tristan to die in her arms. Then a second ship arrives with Mark and his men. There's another little conflict. Courvenal kills Melot. Courvenal is killed by Mark's men, and Isolde, in turn, collapses on top of Tristan's body and dies. So I have given you this plot summary, but as I have already suggested, it's not really all that useful. Quite a lot of the opera consists not of events like sword fights or hunting, but rather consists of people talking to each other. So I have, in a certain sense, told you too much about events that go by rather quickly, of little significance. And in other ways, I've told you too little of things that we are told by the characters, that we hear about, but do not see. So, for instance, a critical bit of backstory that you haven't heard yet is that before the opera began, Tristan killed Isolde's Irish fiancé in combat, and Isolde used her magic powers to nurse Tristan back to health. We don't see this on stage, but we hear about it multiple times. So that's why I mentioned Isolde avenging herself on Tristan. She has a specific grudge. I think more importantly, though, one of the big points that I want to make in this talk is that the stage action, the actual events of the opera, is relatively unimportant in comparison to the inner lives of the title characters. Or another way of putting it is that interior action is much more important than exterior action. So since I'm a historian, I want to say at least a couple words about the gestation of the opera. Wagner seems to have first conceived of Tristan in 1854. That's when he was 41 years of age. He had been in exile in Switzerland since his active participation in unsuccessful revolts or revolutions in Dresden in 1849. Since being banished from Germany, he had been cut off from most sources of income and found himself in need of money. At this time, he was in the midst of composing the Ring cycle. He'd composed the poems for all four operas and completed the music for the first two of them, Rheingold and Valkyrie. But this was a problem. First off, he wasn't planning to produce any of the Ring operas until all four were complete. And it wasn't as if theaters were lining up to produce these operas in the first place. So he had no prospect of performances for the Ring operas. So bizarre as it may seem from our vantage point, Tristan was originally intended as a kind of practical money-making venture. Wagner was hoping to write a sort of very practical chamber opera with a small cast and a small opera that would quickly be taken up by European theaters. Now, it's easy to play this as kind of a joke, since what Wagner actually produced was a 4-hour plus long opera whose leading roles are still amongst the most difficult to cast and perform in the operatic repertoire. For instance, when the opera was finally premiered in Munich in 1865, thanks to the patronage of the then 20-year-old King Ludwig II of Bavaria, the Tristan, Ludwig Schnorr, died after 4 performances. His wife, the first Isolde, you see the two of them in this picture, grief-stricken, never sang again. Now, whether or not Schnorr was actually done in by the demands of singing Tristan, which I tend to doubt, his death did nothing to improve the reputation of the work as practical and performable. So there does seem to be a disjunction between the financial incentives that motivated Wagner to compose the opera and the deeply personal, erotic, and even philosophical opera that he produced. I bring this up, however, not to scold Wagner for failing to realize his intentions, but rather to think a little bit about the ways in which those intentions did shape the opera that you're about to see. So I think that actually, if we squint hard enough in the right way, the outlines of that modest, very performable chamber opera that Wagner hoped to write are still perceptible. So, for instance, the near exclusive focus on the title characters, Tristan and Isolde, comes from Wagner's desire not to require a large number of skilled singers. The striking lack of external action is due to the lack of smaller roles, limited role of the chorus, and so forth. And we don't have great conflicts between masses of people and things like that. And that's one of the reasons why so much of the backstory is narrated to us rather than demonstrated on stage. Moving quickly past the gestation of the opera, though, I would like to return to this idea that music is unusually important in this opera, even for an opera and even for a Wagner opera. It takes on a symbolic and expressive weight in Tristan that goes far beyond what is typical for Wagner and has also had an outsized impact on the subsequent history of classical music. So the most influential portion of the opera is its orchestral prelude. Now, keep in mind that people had an opportunity to hear the orchestral prelude as an excerpt in symphonic concerts long before they had an opportunity to hear the entire opera. So, in a certain sense, the prelude before the opera was performed stood for the entire opera. And in other ways, the very beginning of the prelude, and in particular, the very first moment when we hear more than one note at the same time, the first chord, the notorious Tristan chord, has taken on an enormous and weighty importance for later composers. So it's a little difficult to describe in words, but what you're about to hear at the beginning of the prelude is something, and I apologize for using the same words over and over again, it's going to give a sense of sort of yearning and striving. We're going to hear a kind of soft melodic line from the cellos, and then a sort of sharper chord from the winds, from the double reed instruments. And that chord is the famous Tristan chord. And without getting into music theory speak, it's a sonority that we don't usually encounter in music of the 18th and 19th centuries. It doesn't have a function. It's not leading to an obvious place. It's a chord of mystery and confusion. So it does go someplace, but that sort of trails off. And so that gesture of this unusual chord and the trailing off, we hear this three times, each time a little higher, each time a little more intense. But again, it fails to go anywhere. Then the tail end is sort of broken off. It becomes even more fragmented. Then we get a gesture that does lead someplace, and we get a very beautiful melody, again in the cellos, a lush texture. But again, we still haven't quite gotten where we want to go. So again, I want to suggest that the sense of wanting to get someplace and not getting there is the thing that we're really going to take away from it. So words, not as good as music. Let's watch and listen to an actual performance of the first couple minutes of the prelude, for I hope will match the description that I just gave to you. And I give a blanket apology for abrupt endings to musical examples. It's impossible to find a place to end in this opera because the musical texture is so continuous. I'm afraid all of the examples will have, unfortunately, abrupt endings. So this is music you're going to hear a lot, particularly in the first act of the opera. Sometimes you'll just hear the famous chord. Sometimes you'll hear that kind of upwards crawling gesture, but sometimes you'll hear long stretches that come straight out of the prelude. And the time which is most striking comes very near the end of the first act, just as Tristan and Isolde are drinking the potion, which they think is a death potion, but is in fact the love potion. So they drink the potion. Wagner has very elaborate stage directions at this point. They gaze into each other's eyes, their expressions change, they are filled with love. And as this recognition that they are not dying, that they are in fact in love, is silently taking place on stage, the orchestra is playing recognizable music from the prelude. And so now this music of yearning and striving is associated with that specific moment of awakening. When we get to that moment of kind of partial arrival, the loudest and luscious texture in the excerpt that you just heard, the cello melody, that is when they start singing or speaking to each other. They say each other's names. They begin to interact with each other as human beings that are in love with each other. And so it's not just that the music of the prelude generally suggests magic and potions and yearning, but that moment within the prelude is associated with their recognition of love. So we've heard the music a number of times by then. Now we get very specific reference. So let's now listen or watch, in this case, we'll move to a DVD of a 2007 production from Glyndebourne with Nina Stemme as Isolde and Robert Gambill as Tristan, or Stemme, I'm sorry. I should check that ahead of time. And so this is something where visually, you're not going to be able to tell what's going on for a moment, but as we get closer to the moment of arrival, the characters will emerge from the purple miasma, and you should recognize the music that you just heard, but now turned into something that has, dramatic and narrative meaning. Again, an abrupt ending. So my main point in choosing this excerpt is to allow you to juxtapose the music of the prelude with the music of the very end of the act and see how we kind of emotionally reinterpret it when it's accompanied by stage action. I think there are many, many moving moments in the opera. This is very high on the list. I did let the thing run on a little bit so that you can hear the sailors from off stage in this production, saying "Hail to King Mark, hail to King Mark," giving a sense of the world around Tristan and Isolde, and that very strong conflict between what's going on in their inner emotional life, falling in love, the recognition that it's not a death potion, and the world around them, where everyone else except the two of them thinks that what's going on is the ship is arriving in Cornwall, that Isolde is going to be married off to King Mark, which in fact she will be. And the two of them are completely lost to the world. So that is something which is a very big deal in the opera in general. And I want to continue on that theme, move to Act Two, and talk more about this internal and external action idea, and then put it in the specific context of the second act, particularly of the very, very long duet between Tristan and Isolde that makes up most of that act. So in Act Two, this division between external and interior action gets mapped onto a division between day and night. So as you might remember, one of the things that I mentioned is that each of the acts takes place either in day or night. So it's sort of like a little triangle structure, a little arch. Act One is in the day, Act Two is at night, Act Three is during the daylight again. So Act Two is the night of love. So as I say, this division between let's do it the other way around. External and interior gets mapped onto day and night. So let's think about this a little bit. Excuse me. In Act One, in the daylight, until they drink the potion, Tristan and Isolde are defined, both by themselves and by others, in terms of their external attributes and social and political relationships. Tristan is consistently referred to as a hero, as a knight, in terms of his relationship to King Mark, to Cornwall, to honor. Isolde, meanwhile, is a spoil of war being brought to Mark as part of the peace agreement. So back in the first act, that when Tristan and Isolde first talk to each other, their first conversation is almost legalistic. They discuss whether the peace agreement between Cornwall and Ireland also applies to them as individuals. Does Tristan still owe Isolde a personal gesture of atonement? And Tristan is sufficiently motivated by honor that he's willing to drink poison to atone for having killed Isolde's fiancée. After they have drunk the potion, they are not only in love, but completely disconnected from the external world. Brangäne describes them as being in a dream state. Tristan no longer knows who King Mark is. Isolde doesn't even know where she is. So Act Two is not only about Isolde and Tristan managing to be alone and to consummate their love, but even more about returning to and remaining in this dream state. On a literal level, Isolde and Brangäne are listening to the hunting horns of King Mark and his men fade away into the distance as the men and the external world become more distant, and as night falls, Brangäne extinguishes a torch as a signal to Tristan that it is safe to join them. When Tristan arrives, there is an extensive discussion of the desirability of darkness and of the parallels between dousing the torch and the fall of night. In fact, this discussion is so prolonged that the whole section gets its own special name in German, the Tagesgespräch, the conversation about day. So here's just one tiny excerpt, one verbal excerpt in Andrew Porter's excellent translation from the conversation about day. So this is from Tristan. The daylight, the envious daylight, the hard-hearted foe. I hate and loathe it. You quenched the torch, Could I quench the day to revenge the suffering of lovers and quench the day's cruel torment? So again, torch, day, torch out, night, night equals love, love equals release from torment, all very much on the surface. In fact, if it's not too sort of mechanistic and reductive, it's very easy to, as I have done here, make a chart where we kind of put all of the good stuff on the left-hand side and all of the undesirable stuff on the right-hand side. So on the positive side, we have interaction, which is nurtured at night, in the dark, when we dream, and it makes love possible. And the characters that live in that column are Tristan and Isolde. And so most of the opera is about, in some sense, literally, metaphorically, musically, separating all of those things from the other stuff, the external action, day, light, a waking state, socio-political relationships, King Mark, his knights, Maylott, and so forth. So one thing that I perhaps should have mentioned earlier is that one of the ways that this happens musically is that Tristan and Isolde has an unusual amount of music that we hear from off stage that would also be audible to the other characters. So the first act opens with a sailor singing a kind of quasi folk song from off stage. That's a song that the other characters hear and recognize as such. Brangäne says to Isolde, "Listen to the sailor singing the folk song." The second act begins with the offstage hunting horns. And again, Brangäne says, look, the hunting horns are still audible. King Mark isn't far enough away. That's sort of real music, external action music. Third act begins with a shepherd playing his pipe to signal to Tristan that the ship has not yet arrived. Same thing. Tristan and Kurvenal both hear the pipe and talk about it. So Wagner makes a very big deal of separating that kind of on-stage external action music from the kind of music that you heard from the prelude, which is very much about the inner lives of Tristan and Isolde, who are really the only two characters who get inner lives in this opera. Also, I think that, looking at something like this, thinking about this division of things into two columns, suggests that rather than this sort of the love triangle idea, there are lots of operas with love triangles, right? Where baritones are trying to keep sopranos and tenors from getting together. This really isn't one of those operas. It's not about King Mark as a romantic rival to Tristan. Rather, King Mark is someone who is permanently enmeshed in the external world of politics, duty, and honor. After Tristan has drunk the potion, he and King Mark are incapable of understanding each other or even of communicating with each other. When I say they live in different worlds, I mean this in a fairly crude and literal sense. Now, I would like to say that some of this about night and dark and day and light probably feels a little counterintuitive. I feel that I at least have been conditioned in opera world to associate day and light with the forces of good. Think about the magic flute, which some of you may have just seen in San Jose. In this opera, it's the other way around. The darkness of night is the place where we want to be, or where Tristan and Isolde want to be. But perhaps worse yet, we need to make one more, possibly even more counterintuitive connection, and that is to add death onto our list of positive attributes. For Tristan and Isolde, death is the ultimate extinguishing of light, the next step beyond sleep, and the one place where they can truly be together and separate from the world of appearances. From this point of view, Brangäne's shenanigans with the potions are really irrelevant. Love and death are the same. Both potions are in some sense the same. And this is a potion that was explicitly endorsed by Wagner, who himself called the music of the prelude the Liebestod, or the love death, which is one word in German. Most of the second act is an extended love duet containing, I think, the most ecstatically beautiful music that Wagner, or some would say, anyone ever composed. Whole thing's wonderful. I think there are two especially beautiful moments within it, moments when the lovers unite musically and verbally to express the same sentiments. The first one does what we've been talking about and equates night and love. And for now, I'll just give you the text. The two, Tristan and Isolde, sing together, "Oh, sink around us, night of loving. Let me now forget I'm living. Bear me softly unto thee from the world. Oh, set me free." So again, that reinforces this lining up of love being possible at night, a night of loving in which the lovers can be free and released from the external world. But the part I want to listen to is the second part, which I think is even better, and more to the point will come back, especially at the end of the opera. So I think it's will be significant and rewarding to hear it now. So this comes rather nearer the end of the second act. And this is both the verbal moment when love and death are most explicitly linked, and also the musical answer to the yearning of the prelude. Here, finally, we have the music of fulfillment. And this too, as I've already mentioned, will come back. So we're about to hear that. I'll read you the text first. The Tristan will first sing, and then Isolde will sing essentially the same words. "So let us die and never part, die united, heart to heart, never waking, never fearing, nameless, endless rapture sharing, each to each devoted, in love alone abiding." So we will hear the two of them sing that to each other to a repeated melodic fragment, which will become very familiar and will come back one more time at the end of the opera. And also, just because it is so beautiful, I've let the excerpt run long enough so that after what I've just described, we will hear Brangena again off stage singing words of warning. So we won't see her, but you'll see the subtitles and you'll hear her very beautiful melody over a gorgeous orchestral texture, singing the warning that Tristan and Isolde fail to heed when they remain together and allow themselves to be discovered by King Mark at the very end of the act. So here is that duet fragment. Sorry, I should have had this slide up. It's the same cast plus Katrina Carneus as Brangena. Oh, goodness. Isn't that gorgeous? Wow. So, and again, Act Two, there's an hour more where that came from, and same level of exquisite beauty. So you have a lot to look forward to. So I would now like to, and I'm a little worried about the next move because it may not be welcome, particularly during the dinner hour, but I'd like to make one more pass at these divisions between internal and external, night and day, and put it in the context of philosophy. So this will involve introducing the single greatest influence on Wagner's thoughts and ideas at the time that he was composing Tristan and for the rest of his life, the philosophy of Arthur Schopenhauer. Now, a disclaimer. I am not a philosopher. I have not read Schopenhauer in the original. I am not an expert on this material. Credit where credit is due. I am relying heavily on the excellent book, Wagner and Philosophy by Brian McGee, who is a philosopher and also a wonderful communicator about philosophy to the general public and briefly a British member of parliament, very interesting person. So if you want a better account than I am going to give you, I commend you to Brian McGee's work. I'd like to start by emphasizing the impact of Schopenhauer on Wagner. Wagner reads Schopenhauer's major work, The World as Will and Representation, for the first time in 1854. So that is to say, right before he starts working on Tristan. The World as Will and Representation is a very long, very challenging work. 2 volumes, over 1,000 pages. Wagner is transfixed by it. He reads the entire thing 4 times, cover to cover, in the first year after encountering it. He continues to read it regularly for the rest of his life. According to the diaries of his second wife, Cosima, it was a regular event for them in the evenings. Their sort of version of finding a nice series on Netflix was to sit down with Kant and Schopenhauer and read it in the evenings and discuss it. According to those same diaries, on the very last day of Wagner's life, Wagner said of Schopenhauer, "How can I thank him enough?" Wagner, who is not generally known for taking an interest in other people and other people's work, becomes a great advocate for Schopenhauer. He pushes his philosophical treatises on his friends. He even attempts to set up a chair at the University of Zurich for Schopenhauer studies. And I think, it's very easy to emphasize the kind of, egotistical, megalomaniac side of Wagner. But I do want to emphasize that, Wagner had genuine intellectual interest. He really cared about philosophy. He read deeply in it and made a real effort to understand it. He was intellectual in a way that was unusual for composers, if perhaps not quite at the level that he would have liked for himself. So, what is it that Schopenhauer said, and why was it so compelling for Wagner? And more to the point, what does it tell us about Tristan? So this is going to be, I'm not even sure I want to try and glorify it as Schopenhauer 101. This is going to be very, very superficial. But here is again, a rather glib and schematic introduction to the main points. So the first point, which is something that Schopenhauer got from Kant, goes like this. We humans experience reality through our sensory apparatus and through the intellectual categories that we create to describe the things that we perceive, right? We don't know that things exist unless we can touch them, see them, smell them, taste them. I know I left something out. And then we can only think about them if we can label them and categorize them in some way. So that's the world that we live in, of things that are tangible, that we sense, that we can describe and talk about. But Kant says that it's also reasonable to assume that there are other things that exist that we cannot perceive. We can't sense them, nor can we imagine them, because they do not interact with our sensory apparatus. So in the same way that we can't photograph a scent or record a picture, we cannot have any sense of what it is that lies beyond our senses. So Kant is creating this basic division between the knowable perceivable world, what Kant called the phenomenal world, and the world beyond this perceivable world. So that's our starting point. The next move that Schopenhauer makes is that he accepts this division between the phenomenal, the thing that lies beyond the phenomenal, but he modifies and extends it. So first he says, okay, there's something beyond the phenomenal world, but it's just a single undifferentiated thing. There can't be things that are different, because in order to have different things, we need to have intellectual categories, we need to have space, we need to have time. And none of those things exist beyond our perceivable world. So whatever it is that we can't perceive, it's not a bunch of different things. It's just one undifferentiated, non-phenomenal realm. Okay, that's the first move. Second move is these two realms, the phenomenal and the non-phenomenal, are connected. They're actually the same reality apprehended two different ways. So Schopenhauer calls the stuff beyond what we can perceive the inner significance, true but hidden and inaccessible, of what we perceive. So this is very important. The stuff that we can't perceive is the real thing, the truth, but it's always hidden to us. We can never perceive it or know it. But it is just the other side of the same coin of this world of tables and chairs and flowers and music stands and computers and whatnot that we can touch and feel and see and smell and taste. Then, and perhaps less importantly, the third point is that we human beings are just temporary manifestations in this temporal world. In a deeper sense, we are all part of the same existence. And this is important because for Schopenhauer, this is what leads to compassion. If we are beyond the perceivable world, all part of the same reality, then if I injure you, I injure myself as well. And this leads me to have compassion for that reason, that to harm anyone is to harm oneself. So, not particularly helpfully, Schopenhauer called this realm beyond the physical world the will. So, hence the title of his book, The World as Will, that which is beyond the phenomenal world, and representation, where representation is the physical world that we perceive. So that's Schopenhauer right there in the title, will and representation, two sides of the same thing. Now, this is not a comforting philosophy. Schopenhauer sees this reality as amoral and without direction. We are not improving. We are not learning. And as a matter of fact, we humans are constantly, familiar words, yearning and striving for something unattainable. We are doomed to frustration and disappointment. So I'll mention as kind of a side note that after Schopenhauer completed this treatise, he discovered there are very strong ideas between his philosophical ideas and some of the main concepts from Buddhism and Hinduism. And this was something that Wagner knew. Wagner actually proposed around this time to compose an entire Buddhist opera. It would have been a fascinating project had he ever gotten around to it. Okay, so for better or for worse, that's Schopenhauer 101. So, what was in it for Wagner? Well, at one level, it tied very nicely into Wagner's feelings about politics and society. Wagner read Schopenhauer at a time when he was disillusioned with politics and had really lost hope for positive social change. Remember, he was a revolutionary. He had seen the European revolutions of 1848 and 1849 fail. He had seen the conservative reactions against them. He was taking a very dim view of the possibilities of changing the world of politics in what he saw as a positive direction. He reads Schopenhauer at this time. Schopenhauer offers him a worldview in which historical change, social and political relations were essentially irrelevant in comparison to these deeper insights into the nature of human existence. So that was already very attractive to Wagner. But more importantly, Schopenhauer did offer a couple of sort of ways out of this suffering and striving. There were some things that Schopenhauer felt offered up the possibility of overcoming the suffering inherent to the human condition. And so Schopenhauer placed a very high value on two things that were also very important to Wagner: sex and music. For Schopenhauer, the sex drive was second only to self-preservation amongst human relationships, amongst human urges. And he felt that a loving sexual relationship allowed a person to lose their sense of self and experience the kind of oneness with their partner that they would ultimately experience with all of humanity in death beyond the physical world. Or, as Schopenhauer put it, love and sex give, quote, intimate knowledge of the inner essence of the world. So for Wagner, who himself was in love at the time that he composed Tristan, and basically all of whose operas are about loves which are impossible in the physical world, this was a very, very attractive idea. Perhaps even more attractively, though, Schopenhauer also made similar statements about art, which is also something which takes us out of ourselves and gives us access to something beyond the physical perceivable world, but especially about music, which Schopenhauer felt was the highest form of art because it is not representational. Exactly because music cannot tell us a story, cannot paint us a picture, cannot sculpt us a vase, what have you. It is the self-expression of something which cannot be represented. So Schopenhauer took this very, very seriously. He described music as, quote, the voice of the metaphysical will. So again, this is very, very attractive to Wagner, a philosophy which gives such importance to love and to music. All right. So how does this all tie together? Where are we? There we go. How does thinking about Schopenhauer change our experience of Tristan? First off, I think thinking about Schopenhauer clarifies what Tristan and Isolde are talking about, particularly in the second act. So one might think that when Tristan and Isolde finally to get together at night alone in the second act, they would, get on with the consummation business, or at least engage in some romantic wooing. Instead, they spend the better part of an hour discussing philosophy. It's almost more graduate seminar than love duet. As Brian McGee puts it, they, quote, sing metaphysics. So, as I'm sure you've anticipated, we can return, I won't put the slide up again, we can return to our division into two categories and associate that column, the inner action, the night, the dark, the love, the dreaming, with the metaphysical will, with the world beyond the physical. And we could do the opposite as well, right? The external world of day and shepherd's pipes and sailors' songs, that's the phenomenal world, the physical world. So that chart that I tossed up for you earlier is in some ways very much a Schopenhauer chart, where one side is will and one side is representation. And so most of that Act Two love duet is about exactly these categories. So you don't need to think about Schopenhauer. It's a gorgeous act, it's a gorgeous duet, and it's more than possible to appreciate it on the literal level of Tristan and Isolde's need for the cover of night for their assignation, for their fear of discovery in the morning, or just perhaps on this more metaphorical level where night represents a safe haven for love. But if you want to go in this direction, it's also a fairly explicit endorsement of Schopenhauer's philosophy. The final section of the duet is where Tristan and Isolde sing together, quote, now I've cherry-picked things, but they do sing these words, quote, "O endless night, from all waking grief released, no illusion, no more grieving, no more pining. Undivided, never parting in boundless realms of rapture, blessed endless dreaming, no more Tristan, no more Isolde, ever nameless, never parting, endless ever, joined in joy, highest holy love." So, again, we don't need Schopenhauer, although I do think some of these sentiments have a little bit of the danger of they're sort of teetering on the verge of kitsch, perhaps. But again, if we think of this in philosophical terms, it's very specific. There's the waking world, which is grief and illusion and pining. Night gives us a release from that. We are released into a world in which Tristan and Isolde are never parted. They lose their names, they lose their identities. They just become bounded in an endless joy. And so, for me, that really adds something. I also think that thinking about Schopenhauer a little bit explains the somewhat peculiar attitudes of Tristan and Isolde towards death. In Act 3, Tristan simultaneously desperately wishes that Isolde will return to heal him, while also longing for release from his suffering. So it's partially, is there a ship yet? Is there a ship yet? Is she coming? And then when she is coming, he rips off his bandages and starts bleeding and collapses. I find this a little peculiar. But in light of Schopenhauer, this makes more sense. Tristan's longing for Isolde is killing him, but also keeping him alive. He cannot die until he is reunited with and released by Isolde. So again, on a literal level, he's been wounded by a sword, he's bleeding, he's delirious, he dies. But on, I think, the more important philosophical level, Tristan and Isolde die because it is their only release from the world which cannot contain their love. And that feels to me more meaningful. Finally, Schopenhauer also explains a lot about the music. So Schopenhauer, who, by the way, to the best of my knowledge, the only major philosopher to include musical examples in his philosophical treatises, felt that music was a manifestation of the metaphysical will exactly because it consisted of melodies and harmonies that want to close and resolve, just as humans yearn for fulfillment. So he wrote of chords that are suspended, that do not resolve, is, quote, this is clearly an analog of the satisfaction of the will, which is enhanced through delay. So I'm sure you can see where I'm going with this. What better description of the prelude than a series of chords that yearn for a resolution that obstinately refuse to arrive? So in light of Schopenhauer, this is not just that music from the prelude. It's not just the music of magic or the music of potions or the music of the desire of love. This is Wagner composing Schopenhauer's metaphysical will, the yearning and the striving. But more generally, Wagner's devotion to Schopenhauer puts extraordinary weight on the music of the opera. For the Wagner of Tristan, music was the highest of art forms and is responsible for expressing humanity's deepest urges and desires. So on one level, this explains the variety of types of music in Tristan. We've already spoken about this, the music for the external visible reality, and also the music that represents yearning and release from yearning. But the success of Tristan rests entirely on Wagner's ability both to convince us of the importance of these ideas and to compose music of corresponding power of beauty. If music is going to be the voice of the metaphysical will, that had better be very powerful music indeed. And miraculously, Wagner was fully up to the task. And so I'd like to conclude with almost the very, very end of the opera. This is the final, almost aria-like moment where Isolde sings over Tristan's insensate body. And this is the passage that Wagner referred to as Isolde's transfiguration, sung again over Tristan's body as Isolde is transfigured by love and joins him in death. Now, incredibly, according to Isolde, this transformation is apparently achieved through music. Isolde, and only Isolde on stage, hears music pouring from Tristan's body. She asks King Mark and the other people on stage, don't you hear this wondrous glowing melody? Apparently they don't, but this surrounds her. She sinks into it and drowns in this melody and into highest love, which are the final words of the opera. And this wondrous, glorious melody is that music that you've already heard from that Act 2 love duet. So the two pieces of music that I pushed the hardest, the music of the prelude, the music of the end of the Act 2 love duet, one is the music of yearning and striving, the other is the music of its ultimate fulfillment. And they both fulfill that role, those roles in stunningly magical ways. So I will give the final word to arguably the greatest Isolde of the 20th century, Kirsten Flagstad. I'm a big fan of historic recordings. So this is not one of her famous recordings. This is a live performance here in San Francisco with the San Francisco Opera Orchestra, conducted by its founder for a Standard Oil Hour radio broadcast of 1949. So I'm not going to play the entire thing. It'll take about 4 minutes because I think if you want to hear the last notes of the opera, you should sit through the entire opera. But this will get us through the part about hearing the music coming from Tristan's body. And I'm going to show you the libretto. It's in rather small print, but I hope you can make something out. So here is Kirsten Flagstad in 1949. Okay, thank you very much for attending. And if I remember my cues correctly, I believe now we invite you to ask questions.
Yes, thank you so much, Derek. I don't even know what to say. That was such a fantastic and very surprising lecture, I think. Um, we really appreciate you being here.
Thanks so much for having me, Max. And yeah,
Um,
we aim for surprising.
yes, I was like, Schopenhauer at this hour in the evening. Um, but hello, audience. My name is Max. I work for San Francisco Opera Guild. Please put your questions and comments for Derek in the Q&A. We took some over email as well, so I can read some of those as the Q&A questions come in. Um, First off, I think uh, Tristan has a reputation for being kind of a groundbreaking, unusual opera that deviated a bit from the conventions of opera at that point in history. Could you maybe elaborate a little bit about um, what makes Tristan special as a piece of music?
Sure. As is so often the case, I'm in great danger of going on at greater length and less import than would be desirable. I think to a certain extent, there's too much attention paid to the Tristan chord. There's a thing that people like me tend to do in music history classes where we do exactly what I did at the beginning of the talk and play the first, whatever it is, 2 minutes of the prelude and say, aha, that's the end of harmony as we know it. There's a direct line from there to 20th century modernism. And I don't think it really works that way. The thing that I find, I think, more significant are the ways in which Wagner sort of really leaned into the significance of music. So if we think about where Wagner was well, I mean, if we're thinking only like maybe 3 years earlier, if we're thinking about when he started Tristan, when he was thinking about word and music and also physical gesture and art as being all on the same level, looking for a total artwork where these things are all reinforcing each other. By the time he gets to Tristan, he's given up on that. It's all about the music. And I think that leads to a whole category of very musical operas, and in some ways that is, I think, a greater influence than a particular sonority.
Yeah, thank you. Um, we have a question from Lois. Uh, do you think that Tristan and Isolde's love is totally generated by the potion?
I think this is a bit of a choose your own adventure situation. So, like I say, I heard the opera for the first time in high school. I mean, I still haven't read Schopenhauer in the original. I certainly didn't know anything about it then. And I certainly wasn't thinking about night and day in categories. I took it on a very literal level. I mean, actually, I grew up like a picture book of famous legends, and there was no Song of Roland, and there was Tristan and Isolde. So I thought it was all about the swords and the shields and the healing and the potions and all that. And I think you can enjoy the opera just fine that way. I personally, think that there are some problems where just sort of it's just, I don't, to me the opera is so powerful that the idea that like if they picked a different potion it would have been different. I find it more satisfying to feel as if they're already in love, they've been destined to be together, and the potion just allows them to be who they were all along and releases them from this whole Cornwall versus Ireland and revenge and marriage business and just be human beings that are lost to love. So it's a personal thing, but I find that more satisfying.
Yeah, no, that makes
I,
sense.
I I think it was the Wagner biographer Ernest Newman, I hope I'm getting this right, who said that like the potion could well have been a cup of cold tea and it would have had the same effect.
Yeah. All right, we have a new question from Joan. Was Schopenhauer an atheist? Uh, did Wagner continue to be a follower of Schopenhauer throughout his life? And then the rest is anecdotes.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, basically the answer is yes and yes. So it's tricky because Kant is sometimes interpreted as leaving open a space beyond the phenomenal world, which could be seen as a religious space. And I don't think that's a good reading of Kant. On the other hand, Kant was definitely coming very much from the position of being a Christian. So he was not an atheist, although perhaps his philosophy was atheist. Schopenhauer is both an atheist philosophy and, to the best of my knowledge, coming from an atheist position. And in Wagner's case, yeah, he was absolutely a Schopenhauer disciple, very literally to the day that he died. However, as we know from Parsifal, Christian imagery and symbolism and the kinds of truths that can be revealed through religion were very important to him, even if he wasn't attempting to sort of give Parsifal's not a devotional piece, right? So it's tricky to just sort of divide people into atheists and non-atheists. There are really different things at stake.
Um, I'm so stuck on the will and representation. Um, I'm sort of curious, uh, when you were replying to Lois's question about whether the love was truly generated by the potion or whether there was an undercurrent of love already existing, is it possible, as you were sort of discussing that when we die, we kind of return to this same place, that there's this oneness of being that like somehow that can be extrapolated to mean that everyone is in love, that like love is sort of a fundamental connector of reality somehow.
Yeah, I mean, to sort of look at it, I mean, I think that's a very beautiful and moving side of it. I'm going to take the slightly like grumpier, more pessimistic side, which is that, and this is something I didn't get into, is that this idea that Tristan and Isolde are eternally joined in death, that's not Schopenhauer, or for that matter, it's not Buddhism. I mean, if we were really taking Schopenhauer at face value, yes, death releases them from suffering and yearning, but they become one not only with each other, but also with the other people that have died in the course of the opera. They're becoming one with Kurvenal and with Melot, as well as every other human who has ever died in creation. And yes, I think we can also attach that to love and feel better about it. But that's the part where Wagner's, I think, holding on to this more personal sense of love as something enduring that pertains to two individual people rather than really giving himself completely over to Schopenhauer's ideas.
That makes sense. We have a new question from Barbara. Two questions. First is, what one resource do you recommend for an opera neophyte to prepare for viewing Tristan?
So actually, I would recommend a book by an author named William Berger. And I'm not looking at it, so I don't have his resume, but I'm pretty sure he was in the employ of the San Francisco Opera at one point. Maybe he's a translator, I'm not sure. But he's got a series of books about opera, and the one about Wagner is called Wagner Without Fear. Now, I'm going to garble it, but it's got a great subtitle. It's got something like, how to love, understand, and maybe enjoy the music of opera's greatest genius or something like that. And I find this to be a wonderful book. First off, it's hysterical. It's very entertaining, but he's also incredibly well read and makes some, I think, very deep and meaningful points. But, it's all in a very light sense. He tells you things like, for a given opera, like when do you need to visit the restroom? Is there going to be a time to get a meal? Things like that. But he also gets into the historical background and the philosophical and metaphysical meaning. So I find it, this is what I give to students. It's something that I find engaging to read, but that communicates very easily. And it's actually pretty hard to find things like that. Things tend to be either too specialized or not specialized enough, in my experience.
Yeah, completely. Did you read these books in advance of giving this lecture, or had you already read them?
It's rereading for me. I mean, I've been in some sense teaching Tristan for a very long time. So, obviously there are always new things coming out, so you're constantly reading. But the McGee I got into a lot more deeply this time than I had in the past. The
Excellent.
Schopenhauer book, the Wagner and philosophy book.
We have a new question from Peggy, which is really good historical context. Was Tristan an instant success? What was the critical reception like?
Oh no, not at all. Quite the contrary. Wagner had a lot of trouble getting it performed. And like, I think this is partially because of, again, the enormous difficulties of the title roles. It's just hard to get people to sing it, but also the whole kind of practical chamber opera thing really backfired. This wasn't the kind of opera that opera companies were designed to put on. So it's sort of neither nor. It's not if you're, I don't know, if you're in Paris and you're an opera company and you're getting ready to put on lots of grand operas, you can't do this one. It's got the wrong number of acts. There's no ballets. There isn't enough chorus stuff. But on the other hand, it's too hard for a genuinely small company to do. Yeah, no, alas. Now, the orchestral excerpts got played a lot. Wagner conducted them himself. He did basically the very beginning of the opera, the prelude, and the very end, the two bits that we heard at the very beginning and end of the top. So of the talk. So people heard a lot of that. Now, I'm not sure popular is the right word, but it was at least widespread. Lohengrin was the really big hit. That was the one that people knew really well and that got played a lot.
Yes. I remember reading he went to so many different opera houses to try and get this produced, and it took an eternity to debut.
Exactly. Yeah. My favorite story about that is apparently one of the places where he almost had a performance lined up was in Brazil. I think it would have been fabulous if, like, the premiere of Tristan had taken place in Brazil.
That would be so cool. Um, I I have one question, personal one, from the Glyndebourne production, Glyndebourne. Hmm?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure. Sorry, I should have looked that up ahead of time.
But it was so mysterious and unusual the way that they had the set with all of those concentric rings.
Yeah.
What do you think that was about? What is the conveyance there?
Well, so I think, at one level, and I'm not totally making this up because, like, the DVP comes with, like, little, director's notes and things like that. But I mean, so at one level, it's, I think, reinforcing this idea that, hey, we don't really care about the ship and the shepherd's pipe and the trees and the tower and things like that, all that kind of medieval stuff. That's just sort of illusion and appearance. What we really care about is the inner world of Tristan and Isolde. And so I think, the circular stage element, first off, right, circular, it's a oneness thing, it's a cycle, but it's also something that focuses our attention on this at sort of a symbolic level rather than encouraging us to think about Tristan and Isolde in the context of human relations and physical objects. Now, I'm a very literal minded person. I would be happier if the first act was in the light rather than in the dark, because the whole, light, dark, light thing would come out.
Yeah.
But, that's okay.
Yes.
It does get light at the end of the second act when King Mark shows up, so I like that.
It does feel very abstract. I like that.
Yeah.
It feels like it pulls you out of the narrative itself and forces you to grapple with the music more, which is really
Yeah.
cool. But that's not the one we're doing, everyone.
Right,
When
right.
you come, we're doing a slightly different production at San Francisco Opera. It's still
Which
going
I'm
to be
very
great,
much
though.
looking forward to, because again,
Yes.
I'm literal minded. I like things like that.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think we have exhausted all the audience questions. But thank you again, Derek. This was so
And
cool.
possibly exhausted the audience as well. No, I thank you so much for having me. This is a real pleasure. It's
Um,
really
I'm going to
great to
hand
work
things
with you.
off. Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
But we really appreciate you. I'll hand things off to Peggy, who's going to do final announcements, and the recording will be online in about 24 hours. So if you want to send this to anyone, I will send out the recording to everyone who signed up on Eventbrite to disseminate accordingly. All right.
Well, thank you very much for joining us tonight, and hope you can get to the Opera House to see this wonderful, interesting opera. And if you can't make it to the Opera House, of course, you can live stream it Sunday, October 27th at 1 p.m. Sign up on the San Francisco Opera website, and hope to see you for our upcoming previews. Thursday, October 24th, 6 p.m., Kip Crana will discuss Beethoven's Ninth, because as you know, there's a concert, San Francisco Opera concert of Beethoven's Ninth. However, it's all sold out already, but I'm sure the preview will be fascinating. And then on November 7th at 6 p.m., join us for Carmen. We have a new preview speaker, Dr. Elisa Dieter. And that opera, hopefully you can get tickets for that, but also it'll be live streamed on Thursday, November 19th. And then we'll be back in the spring to see you, or in the summer to see La Boheme and Idiomeno. Thank you for joining us tonight. Looking forward to seeing you soon. Thank you. Good night.